Well, you know the story so far. You know that the Hebrews have been enslaved in Egypt. God has heard their cries and has led them out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses. And you know it's not been easy in the wilderness. The Hebrew people have cried out that they needed food, and God provided. The Hebrew people have cried out that they needed water, and God provided. And now Moses is up on the mountain, hanging with God, grooving on the 10 Commandments, and the people are terrified. Which seems a little bit absurd, a little bit insane. I mean, my goodness, they have been brought out of Egypt by the hand of God in incredibly powerful ways, and God has been present to them as a cloud by day and a fire by night. God has been living out those promises in profound ways, and yet they're afraid. They are afraid that they will never see this man Moses again, and they are afraid that God is not with them. Peter Steinke unpacks what happens to us when we are afraid. When the Hebrew people got frightened, highly anxious, agitated, it was even ramped up and aggravated by a sense that there was so much out of their control. And fear distorts reality. And the survival brain kicks in, and the thinking brain shuts down, and they were unable to see reality. In fact, their fear distorts reality. It distorts what they are able to see and to hear and to understand. Anxiety causes an emotional barrier, an imaginative gridlock. And the people cannot imagine that this Moses would come down the mountain to be with them. They cannot imagine that God would keep those holy promises. And so they take matters into their own hands. And they ask Aaron to make gods for them. And Aaron makes a golden calf, a symbol of the fertility gods of the land that they were wandering around in. And the people worship the golden calf, and then we are told they rise up to revel. It's really interesting, the link between worship and serving. In fact, worship and service are the same word in both Hebrew and Latin. And so what they worshiped, they then rose up and lived out in their actions as a reflection of what they worshiped. And so here they were worshiping a fertility god. They rise up to revel. Folks, this is the kind of party your parents always told you to stay away from. This was not good. When people come to me and say that they don't believe in God, this is what I know. Whether we claim a God in our lives or not, we all worship something or someone. For all of us, there is something or someone that orients our lives, that aligns our lives, that motivates us, that moves us, that is a place of centering for us. And whatever it is, that someone or something that we worship, that is what gives direction to our lives. That is where we invest the bulk of our time and attention. That is the source of our action. That connection between worship and service is as real today as it was when the Hebrews were wandering in the wilderness. And so if what we worship is the almighty dollar, then we are investing a great deal of time and energy in amassing more. If what is at the center of our life is our possessions, then the bulk of our attention goes to acquiring possessions and to caring for possessions and ensuring them and protecting them. If our children are at the very center of our lives, then the bulk of our attention goes to them. And if success is what drives us, then however we define success, whether it's work, whether it's school, whether it's sports, that's where our energies are going to go. And in the church, whether we realize it or not, sometimes it seems the God that we worship is the God of comfort. And so we work hard to keep things familiar and safe and secure. In the second commandment that God was giving Moses up on the mountaintop, God makes it clear that God is full aware that there are lots of gods that get worshiped. In God saying, "You shall have no other gods before me," God is simply saying, I know there are a whole lot of gods, but I'm demanding to be the top priority in your life. I'm demanding your top loyalty. But this is what happens. We get scared. We have high anxiety. We get agitated and aggravated because there's so much in our lives that seem out of our control. And when we are frightened and when we are anxious, well, the survival brain shuts down, and the survival brain, ramps up, and the thinking brain shuts down. In fact, the thinking brain is closed for business. And fear distorts our perception of life. In fact, we are unable to see clearly or to hear clearly or to think and understand clearly. We hit an emotional barrier. We hit an imaginative gridlock. We can't imagine that God is present with us. We can't imagine that God will keep those holy promises, and so we take matters into our own hands. And we make gods in our own image. We fit God in a mold, and in the process, it's essentially as if we put a lid on ourselves, essentially as if we've chosen to limit ourselves.
Training fleas requires a glass jar with a lid. The fleas are placed inside the jar and the lid is then sealed. They are left undisturbed for 3 days. Then, when the jar is opened, the fleas will not jump out. In fact, the fleas will never jump higher than the level set by the lid. Their behavior is now set for the rest of their lives. And, when these fleas reproduce, their offspring will automatically follow their example.
Our anxiety places an imaginary lid on our lives. In fact, the fleas of worry and fear and anxiety limit us and distort reality. Now, let me be honest. We all worship other gods, including me. For Jesus in the wilderness, he was tempted to worship the gods of power and possessions and prestige. And these other gods can indeed bring a sense of happiness and even security, but there are no other gods who will set us free. And there are no other gods who keep their promises. And so God says to Moses, get down there and tell the people that there's another way, that there's a better way. When we remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, when we gather together for worship, we are coming together to realign ourselves, coming together to reorient ourselves from the temptations of worshiping other gods during the week. We come together to be recreated and to be renewed, for we are not made in the image of fleas. We're made in the image of God. And because we're made in the image of God, we rest on the seventh day in the same way that God did. When God rested, that literal word is God exhaled, which is an incredible image. God is inhaling during those 6 days of creation. God is inspired. God is filled with imagination, and God is creating. And then on the seventh day, God rests. God exhales. And so here we are, and we gather to worship, and we exhale. We are forgiven. We are loved. We remember that we are made in the image of God, and that in the image of God there are no limits. And in the image of God, our imaginations soar. We exhale gratitude, as the choir sang to us this morning. We gather to worship, and we rest, and we exhale so that we can go forth in the same way God did 6 days a week, inhaling God's creation in the world, inhaling God's imagination, inhaling healing and hope and promise in the lives of those whose paths cross ours, in our family and with our friends and neighbors and work and community. Inhaling God's inspired word in and through us, bringing Sabbath, rest, God's presence, God's hope, God's promise to those 6 days a week. And on the seventh, we rest. We exhale once again. We are forgiven. We are loved. We are God's. This rhythm of worship and service, this rhythm of gathering and going, this rhythm of inhaling and exhaling is the rhythm of life. I guess that's why they call Sundays little Easters, times of resurrection, so that we leave this place filled with new life to share with others. But there's another rhythm I want you to notice. Find your pulse, would you please? It's right on your wrist. I know you've got it there. Kind of right down from your thumb. Everybody find their pulse? Anybody not find your pulse? Feel the rhythm? The lub-dub? This too is the rhythm of life. And if you've got a pulse, God has a plan for the things that you will go and do in the name of God, serving God, as you leave this worship, as you leave this place. On your mark, get set, go. Amen.